Hey guys! I miss you all, and I hope that we can be back in school soon. But until then, we'll just keep pushing on and working through our Reimagine Day packets, and I'll be checking in on you guys. If you ever need anything, give me a call. Today, I wanted to read to you guys If Your Name Was Changed at Ellis Island. I'm not going to be reading the whole story because it is rather lengthy, but I do know that one of your Reimagine days was talking about Ellis Island, and you had to fill out a questionnaire that goes along with it. So I just thought it'd be good to kind of talk to you guys a little bit and read the story. This is something I would normally do whenever we would come back from a Reimagine day. So I wanted to make sure that you guys had this information. So America has always been a nation of immigrants, people who have moved to the United States from other countries. Even the first Americans, the Indians, are believed to have crossed the Bering Strait over a strip of land that once connected North America with Asia thousands and thousands of years ago. It was the greatest human migration in history. By the end of the 1800s, Italians, Poles, Armenians, Russians, and others from South and Eastern Europe began to pour into America. On the West Coast, Chinese and Japanese immigrants arrived. We don't really know exactly how many people came because for long periods of time, no records were kept. And there were some people that were not counted. We do know that nearly 35 million people came to America in 100 years. In that year, 1924, strict immigration laws were passed to limit the number of people who entered the country. This book is about their journey, their hopes and difficulties, and their adventure. For these immigrants, America was their destination, and Ellis Island was their first stop. So what was Ellis Island? Ellis Island was an immigration center located in New York Harbor. Millions of newcomers passed through its gates, were examined by doctors and legal inspectors. Some were allowed to enter the United States right away. Some were detained, which means held for a while, and others were deported. Before Ellis Island opened, immigrants had been examined at Castle Garden at the tip of Manhattan Island. At one time, Castle Garden had been a fort, then a concert hall. In 1855, it was turned into an immigration center. 35 years later, it was no longer big enough to handle the thousands of new immigrants arriving daily. So the U.S. government decided to use a small piece of land in New York Harbor known as Ellis Island for a new immigration center. The Ellis Island Station opened in 1892. During the next 30 years, more people came to America than any other time. At least 12 million of them passed through Ellis Island. Okay, now I'm just kind of trying to flip through. Okay, who examined you at Ellis Island? Doctors were the first to examine you, and they began before you even knew it. When you walked up to the stairs to the Great Hall, doctors were watching you. They wanted to see if you limped or had any difficulty breathing. When you reached the top, they looked at your skin, throat, hands, and scalp. Children older than 2 had to walk by themselves. All immigrants were asked their names to see if they could hear and speak. Other doctors used a finger or a metal button hook to roll your eyelids back to see if you had a contagious eye disease called trachoma. One little girl was almost sent back home because her eyes were all red. She had been sick on board ship and had cried so much that her eyes were sore. After 3 days of rest, she was allowed to stay. They walked up the stairs called the 6-second medical, and then the doctors at the top usually took 2 to 3 minutes to examine you. All of these exams together usually took less than 5 minutes. If the doctors thought something was wrong, they would put a chalk mark on your clothes at your shoulder or back. And X stood for possible mental problem. B stood for back, E, eyes, P for physical or lungs, SC for scalp, L for lameness, CT for trachoma. Every child's head and nails were examined for lice and contagious disease called Favis. If you had a chalk mark, you did have to go for further examinations. One young girl, nervous about leaving her home and coming to a new country, had developed warts on her hands. The doctor chalked an X on her coat. She and her family were very afraid that she might be sent back home. She was wearing a new coat with very pretty lining. A kind man told her to turn the coat inside out so the chalk mark wouldn't show. She never found out if he was an inspector or an immigrant, but she did what he suggested and was not examined again. If you were detained, you were to take into a special area for further examination. If your sickness was curable, you were kept in a hospital until you were better. Many babies and young people arrived with measles, scarlet fever, or diphtheria. Favis, a scalp and nail disease, was also common. Most children stayed in the hospital 1 to 2 weeks before they were released. If your disease was contagious and incurable, you were put in a special hospital until a steamship took you back to the seaport where you came. Did you have any money when you arrived? The United States immigration law said that a person could not come into the country if he or she would become a public charge. This meant that the government did not want to have to pay money to house, clothe, or feed people. And so the Commissioner of Immigration made a rule that everyone entering the country had to have $10 and money for railroad tickets. Later, the amount was raised to $25. $25 was a lot of money for many immigrants. People had often worked months to save that much. Immigrant aid groups in America challenged the rule in the court case. Even though the rule was dropped, many inspectors continued to use it. Immigrants often helped one another. They often passed inspection. They would secretly hand the money down the line to those behind them. Others were helped by ship's officers. Since the steamship companies had to pay for you to return had to pay for your return trip if you were not admitted, some ship officers lent immigrants money until they had passed through the inspection. But as soon as they passed through, the immigrants had to pay it back. If you didn't have enough money, you were often detained for days until a relative or friend sent you the money at Ellis Island. Did you have a job waiting for you? No, and if you did, you would be sent back to your homeland. In 1885, the U.S. Congress passed a law that said employers could not make contracts with immigrants to bring them into America, promising them jobs. This presented a real problem for immigrants. On the one hand, they couldn't have a job waiting for them, and on the other, they had to show that they were able and willing to work and wouldn't have a problem getting a job. If you couldn't support yourself, you would become a public charge, and then the government could send you back to your old country. Did some American immigrants change their names when they came to America? Some people changed their names or had them changed by an official, like a ship's officer or an Ellis Island inspector. Some immigrants were afraid that they wouldn't be allowed to enter if they had a long or unpronounceable names. One young man who came from Russia in 1905 was concerned about his name, so he shortened it from Katznelson to Nelson. As a child, Nathan Levine learned that his name wasn't Levine. When his father came to America, he had a long Russian name. The immigration inspectors, Nathan was told, changed many Jewish names to Levine or Cohen. And so his father, Louis Nemogoski, became Louis Levine. One woman who had worked on Ellis Island for the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society recalled how inspectors sometimes changed a person's name, often because of a misunderstanding. There was a story about one family that got its name in an unusual way. When a family member arrived in this country, he explained that he was a Yosman, which means orphan in Yiddish. The next thing he knew, his name was listed as Yosman. For many, their new name was the beginning of a new life. They worked very hard, hoping to provide more for their families than they had as children. Their children became business people, athletes, teachers, doctors, construction workers, and lawyers. The freedom was theirs to choose, and they brought so many to the American shores. When did Ellis Island close? From 1892 until World War I, Ellis Island was the main port of entry to the United States. Millions passed through the Great Hall and down the staircase of separation. Millions made America their new home. But within a few years of the war's end, Congress passed laws that severely limited the number of people who were allowed to come into the United States. In 1965, the island was turned over into a national park. 17 years later, workers began to restore the main building to what it had looked like when thousands had passed through. Ellis Island was reopened as a museum. The Ellis Island story is told on film, tape, and in many exhibits. In the first floor baggage room, you can see an actual steamer truck, suitcases, and baskets the immigrants had brought with them so many years ago. Landing cards, passports, ship's manifest list are on exhibit. You can walk up the stairs, as millions of immigrants did, to the Great Hall and then down the staircase of separation. It is estimated that nearly 1 out of every 2 Americans has had a relative who passed through Ellis Island. Outside a great seawall, the list of the names of some of the immigrants' families from Abrahamson to Zayakson. It is the Ellis Island Wall of Honor, built with the contributions of Americans from many backgrounds. And that's the end. So I hope you guys enjoyed the story. I know it was probably a little long, but that's okay. I'm going to come back more with some more stories that I want you guys to choose from. There'll be a poll up on our Facebook page, so I hope that you can vote and let me know what you want me to read next. All right, bye.